This lesson discusses website hosting. The topics covered are: what is a web host, web hosting packages, local versus offshore hosting, and choosing a Joomla-friendly web host. The whole concept of the internet is that it's a bunch of computers all interconnected with no start or end point. Various services are transmitted via the internet, such as email and the World Wide Web. With the right software, you could store your website on a computer at your home and make it available to the world. But almost no one does this. People expect a website to be available 24/7, 365, which is difficult to achieve from a home connection. A residential or even a business internet connection will occasionally fail. Websites are attacked by hackers sometimes hundreds of times a day, which means regular software updates and monitoring. Most importantly, the available bandwidth on a typical home or business internet connection is nowhere near sufficient to support multiple connections. As a result, most personal, non-profit, and business websites are stored on high-end computers at data centres. The organisations that provide this service are called web hosts, and you'll need an account with one to get your website online. Choosing a web host and an appropriate web plan can be confusing. There are three considerations: the hosting package, the host's geographic location, and in our case, whether or not the host is Joomla friendly. There are various website packages available, and the right choice comes down to how much disk space you require and how much monthly bandwidth you're likely to consume. Both of these variables are difficult to determine from the outset, but you can usually change plans at any time. These days, even a basic plan is often sufficient for a typical small business website. Computers that are responsible for making websites available on the internet are called web servers. Broadly speaking, there are three levels of hosting. Shared hosting. In this scenario, hundreds or thousands of websites are placed on a single web server. So your site shares the resources of the web server with other customers. The advantage of this solution is the hosting fees are inexpensive, as little as a few dollars a month. The disadvantage is if one site is or becomes very popular, they hog the overall resources, which can slow down your website. Nevertheless, this is a popular hosting solution used by millions of websites worldwide. Virtual private server. This is still a shared solution, but special software guarantees a certain amount of server resources for your website. This significantly reduces the likelihood of your site being adversely affected by neighbouring sites. The cost for this solution is higher, but still tends to be under the $50 a month mark, depending on the amount of resources your site requires. Dedicated server. As its name suggests, this is a single server that is for the exclusive use of one customer. They tend to cost over $100 a month, and depending on requirements, can stretch to well over $1,000. Any web server requires some management, which is included with lesser plans. But a dedicated server may be provided unmanaged, which requires a good deal of knowledge. Or you can get a managed dedicated server for an additional cost. Regardless of which package you choose, there are two other features to consider. The first is the operating system. Web server software tends to be powered by the Windows operating system, or Linux. Web hosts who provide Windows hosting have to pay a license fee to Microsoft to use their software. Linux is an open source platform. As such, Windows hosting tends to be a little bit more expensive. The control panel. Almost all website hosting packages include an online control panel where you manage various aspects of your hosting, such as your email addresses, databases, website statistics, and a whole lot more. There are various control panels available, and depending on which host you choose, you may or may not get a say in which one you get to use. For those of you based in the US, This next advice is irrelevant. Just choose a US-based web host and you'll be right. But if, like me, you're based in another country, you need to decide where your website physically lives. Hosting companies are located around the globe, and there is no technical reason why you can't place your website in a data center in a different country. Hosting in the US tends to be the cheapest option, but if your organisation is located elsewhere, there are advantages to choosing a host in or close to your country. Firstly, the website will respond faster to your local audience. Admittedly, this is often just a case of a few milliseconds, but the overall experience, especially on busy pages, can be noticeably better. Secondly, hosts occasionally need to maintain their servers, during which time your site is offline. They do this in the middle of the night in their time zone, which may be the middle of the day in your country. As such, it could mean that your website is down during your peak time. Another consideration is support. You might get no support or limited support during your work hours. As with any software, you will encounter hurdles throughout your journey. In my experience, there are two main causes of frustrations with Joomla. The first is simply a lack of understanding of how Joomla works, and that is of course where I come in. The second cause is the web host, and in many cases this can be overcome by choosing a Joomla-friendly web host. Although Joomla is designed to run in many environments, some environments are better than others. Choosing a good host eliminates many of the typical problems website owners encounter, such as difficulty uploading or using extensions and security. Here are further points to consider when choosing a web host. Joomla requirements. There are certain technical requirements that need to be met, and you can find these listed on the Joomla website. I strongly suggest you choose a host that meets the recommended requirements, not just the minimum requirements. Linux versus Windows. Although Joomla can work quite happily in a Windows hosting environment, I recommend you choose Linux. There are certain extensions that are more difficult to get working in Windows, and as a beginner, you want as few hassles as possible. The vast majority of Joomla sites are hosted using Linux, so if you do run into trouble, you're far more likely to receive helpful advice from others if your site is too. The control panel. As mentioned earlier, your website hosting account is likely to come with an online control panel. The most popular one is called cPanel, and if you have the choice of using it, then go with that, as once again it makes sense to stick with the solution used by the majority. This is the control panel I use throughout my tutorials, so if you have it, you can easily follow along. Support. Choosing a web host that understands and likes Joomla can make a big difference if things go wrong. The blame game happens a lot with hosting. Something goes wrong, you ask the host who blames the software, you ask the software vendor who blames the host, and the game continues. Choosing a host that supports Joomla means that they are more sympathetic when things go wrong. That doesn't necessarily mean they can solve the problem, as it might not be an issue at their end, but they should at least be able to point you in the right direction. Resources. Web hosting accounts usually have restrictions on the amount of disk space and bandwidth, website visitors, you can use. Be wary of plans that are quoted as unlimited, as there is often a catch. Even the most basic plan can probably support a Joomla site as long as it meets the other requirements mentioned above. Just be sure that you can easily move to a higher plan later if necessary. That completes the website hosting lesson, in which you learnt what is a web host, the various web hosting packages that are available, considering whether to host locally or offshore, and choosing a Joomla-friendly web host. Not surprisingly, the exercise for this lesson is that unless you already have one, you should now go and find a suitable web host. Check out our recommendations on the website under the Resources menu. You might need to consider your domain name needs first though, so if you have any questions about that, watch the next lesson